Hope everybody's staying cool in this hot weather. The special call session of the Board of Trustees for the Spring Independent School District is officially called to order on Tuesday, June 27th. The time is now 6:07 p.m. Trustees present are Trustee Adams, Trustee Durant, Trustee Jensen, Trustee Newhouse, and Trustee McDaniel. I would like to ask everyone to turn off or silence their cell phones or electronic devices. At this time, our Board Vice President and our Board Equity Committee Lead, Winfred Adams Jr., will begin the meeting by reading the Spring ISD Equity Statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Spring Independent School District strongly believes in educational and racial equity as fundamental aspects of its core mission and purpose, embodied through any program, practice, decision, or action that affects all students, with a strategic focus on those choices and policies that most strongly impact marginalized students. We believe all students, regardless of their ability, ethnicity, language, race, religion, gender identity, and status, should have equitable access to opportunities, resources, support systems, and educational rigor in order to maximize their academic success and social-emotional well-being. We believe every Spring Independent School District student is valuable and possesses individual strengths and characteristics that make our district a great place to learn and grow. Moreover, we seek to act on that belief, instituting policies and practices that value diversity, committing ourselves as a district to continued growth and development, and working to support the success of every student in all that we do.
Thank you, Trustee Adams. Our next item is agenda participation. This item allows members of the public an opportunity to speak on agenda items before those items are considered by the board. Mr. Binkley, do we have anyone registered for agenda participation?
No, Madam President, we do not.
Thank you. For our next item, I'd like to recognize our super proud superintendent, Dr. Lapita Inahosa, for comments.
Thank you, President Durant. I know this is a special called session, but I did want to make a few comments. First and foremost, I did want to introduce someone to the staff. I know you hear me joking all the time about that ankle monitor that we place on employees, and when they leave, we reactivate it. But just kidding, just very excited. I know everybody's laughing, even Miss Townsend knows that because she's not going anywhere. She and Mr. and Mrs. Thompson are always here with us. But I do want to formally introduce to this board and those of you that are here today, our Assistant Superintendent of Non-Instructional Data Quality, someone that is no stranger to us, most importantly to our community and the service that she has provided to this district and the community. Back in the fall, she worked with us in our bond steering committee. So I'd like for you all to engage with our Assistant Superintendent, Dr. Julie Guillory. Dr. Guillory. We're so happy to have you. I was sharing with Ms. Durant that at the Leadership Institute, when I had the opportunity to introduce her, all of our principals and leaders were so excited. I had people that were trying to get over their seats to get over to Dr. Guillory. So we are excited to have her back and back home to support us. I also wanted to take a moment, a privilege. I know last week, was it just last week or the week before, we were at the Summer Leadership Institute with TASB. And I have to say to our leaders that are here and those that are watching from home, publicly wanted to thank our board for their support and standing up and showing out Spring ISD. I have to brag because we were there at a conference with thousands of people. It was like overcrowded, right? And the hotel couldn't even manage us. It was people wall to wall. And we were attending breakout sessions. I had the opportunity to observe our board members that as presenters were leading statewide sessions, our board sits back first and foremost and says, oh, we do that in spring. We do that in spring. And you all do the same thing. You know, when we go to conferences, we say, oh, we do that in spring. But do we ever stand up and publicly say, we do that in spring? And I was sitting in a session with Ms. McDaniel, and they were talking about engaging students and specifically engaging the Latino community. And we're whispering, Ms. Correa, Ms. McDaniel, and myself, we do that. And Ms. McDaniel raises her hand, interrupts, stands up, and says, this is what we do in spring. And I sat up a little taller as our board member spoke out in this huge session to talk about what we do in spring. And then we were complaining because there was a session on the student code of conduct. And if you all recall, we had just gone through a work session and a meeting on our student code of conduct. And here TASB was barely doing their session. And we were like, oh no, what is it, $1 late? A day late, dollar short. And we said, we're behind. So I went to find out, okay, what does TASB say? And they went through every single law and checked. And I was taking notes copiously. And then behind me after the session, guess who comes? Miss Newhouse. And she's like, we got this under control. Didn't you say that? And we were just so very proud, boasting that, Spring ISD had taken into account everything that the state was saying. Our president over here sat and not interrupted a session, but she did, talking about, what we do in spring, and to be able to once again in another session stand up proudly and say, this is what we do in spring. And our superintendent has the student advisory committee, and the students are doing this work, and our students served in our bond steering committee. And they're looking, and the presenters are like, okay, let's let spring take over. And then I was driving home and I get a call. Miss Hodges is not here today, but she's talking about the community engagement presentation that she was at. And again, stood up and said, this is what we do in spring. They were talking about a girls empowerment summit, and they called it a damas meaning ladies. So she's like, oh, this is what we do in spring, and we have this and this and this. And so just so very proud. Sat with Mr. Adams at another session. And again, we do that work. We do that work. And I just wanted to publicly say that. Dr. Jensen went to the Fort Worth session in the storm. It's like she went away, abandoned us, but she was at the Fort Worth session, and the same thing. And I just publicly wanted to say thank you to the board for their support, and most important, for their public support out in a statewide conference to talk about what our teams do every day here in spring, and how dedicated our teams are to making sure that every single student receives that excellent and equitable education. And we all agreed that moving forward, we had to submit presentations, because we've got great things happening here in spring, and we sit tall and proud here within spring, but know that our board members are representing us at the state level. And so publicly, thank you so much for your continued support and speaking out on behalf of spring, and most importantly, on behalf of our students. So thank you so very much. We appreciate you.
Would any other board members like to make any comments? Everybody okay? She said it all, didn't she? All right. So our next item, I'd like to recognize our Chief Financial Officer, Ann Westbrooks.
Good evening, President Durant, Dr. Hinojosa, and members of the board. Our first item that we have this evening begins on page 7 of your packets, and it is related to the budget that we're going to spend a lot more time talking about this evening. But the first item has to come before the actual budget adoption. And so this item is the budget for the Student Success Initiative and Accelerated Instruction. And it's required that we set aside these funds as a part of our 23-24 budget to support the cost of the additional accelerated instruction that's needed for our students that fail to perform satisfactorily on their end of course assessments. And so these dollars are budgeted within the state comp ed budget in total of $533,600.
Ms. Westbrooks,
Yes, sir.
what does that pay for exactly? Is it teachers? Is it instructional?
Primarily, it pays for tutorials for our teachers to have Saturday school, evening school, any supplies and materials that are needed to conduct those additional instruction hours for our students that need that accelerated instruction.
So this is the HB 4545?
It is not.
It's not.
A lot of HB 45 is built into the instructional day. This is that time above and beyond that is in the evenings for tutorials, or sometimes we have Saturday school. And so it pays for those teachers that come in and provide that additional instruction.
And this covers all 6 of our high school campuses?
This amount is actually budgeted for within our state comp ed budget for all of the tutorials. And so this is the pot of funds that is utilized for those students that need that extra because they haven't passed on their EOCs. So this is inclusive of, I'm sorry.
That you were done.
So yes, they're included, but it's not just for high schools. This amount is not just high schools. This is the total amount that's budgeted.
So this might be getting in the weeds a little
Can I
bit.
get a motion?
You're right, thank you. Madam President, I move that the Board of Trustees adopt the 23-24 Spring Independent School District budget for Student Success Initiative and Accelerated Instruction.
There's a second?
I second that.
It's been moved by trustee Adams and seconded by trustee Newhouse that the Board of Trustees adopt the 2023 Spring Independent School District budget for Student Success Initiative and Accelerated Instruction. Are there any questions?
So, thank you. Sorry about that. So how does a student access that program, this Saturday program?
So I'm going to look across the hall to our curriculum chief over there and see if you or Dr. Parasol, Dr. Cuellar or Dr. Parasol want to speak more to it. But what I do know is that all of our campuses, typically they begin in the second semester of the year, providing that additional tutorials after school and again on Saturdays. We do have some principals that will begin in the fall, and they've already identified their students based on their BOY data. And so they're tapping the students on the shoulder and making sure that they know that those instructional opportunities are available for them. And so I don't know if Dr. Cuellar or Dr. Parasol want to add anything to that.
Yes, sir. Ms. Westbrook said it best. Typically, as we identify students that are in need of some additional support, they will work, principals will work very closely with the assistant superintendents of that respective school and develop a very tight intervention plan. And at that point will be the process of identifying how many students, how many days, the frequency, and so forth. And to Ms. Westbrook's statement, that does vary based off of need. Also, it's important to note that a lot of our schools also will leverage and utilize Title I dollars as well to be able to provide that additional support in paying teachers and also utilizing resources for some of those additional programs.
So I'm not recalling ever seeing this before, and maybe that's just my memory.
It is, because it's actually a requirement every year. And so it's the first item before we do the budget adoption each year.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to make some comments because I'm seeing on the news and hearing educators at the national level saying we have profound learning loss through the pandemic, and that some people are estimating that our students have to work 1.5 times as long to try to catch up. I even heard one speaker suggest that we needed a 5th year of high school. And so if this is helping mitigate this without going that route, I'm all for it.
It seems like a small amount. So I imagine it's very targeted. But this is for, I'm just trying to wrap my mind around how this works. So every child who does not pass, say, their algebra EOC needs intervention. And so we do the HB 45 program for those kids. That happens during the school year, during the school day. They're in a class that does that. What is this? This is different from that.
This is above and beyond that.
Okay. So those kids who are not getting what they need in their in school regular intervention get this additional Saturday and evening intervention.
That's correct.
There, that's what I need. Thank you.
This this doesn't affect the, and I hope it doesn't, the Century 21 after-school program that we have for students.
No, it does
does.
not. That
Will
again is
continue.
above and beyond, and yes, ma'am.
Good.
Yes. It makes me happy that you call it Century 21 because I say that all the time. But it's the 21st century. Yes, I say that all the time.
I wanted to understand a little bit more how they're selected and then how they're notified and what does our attendance usually look like?
Usually when the students are identified, administration will work with teachers to identify the selected group of students that need the really targeted intervention. At that point in time, it is a proper practice to actually notify the families that their child has been identified and will need additional learning time to be able to accelerate their learning moving forward. So the parent piece is a very important part of the process to ensure that the parent understands the additional time that's going to be required of their child in extended learning opportunities.
Do we usually see good participation, good attendance?
I would say yes, and I know that because it is targeted. And also, we provide transportation. If the students are required to come to after-school tutorials, we provide that late bus to make sure that they are able to stay and then be taken home in the evening. So yes, because it is targeted, it's not one, everybody comes, it's who needs it, and those teachers are working with that small group of students.
So that raises the question of like, how successful is it? And what's the data around the return on our investment of this $533,000?
I would say I know at the school level, the students are coded, those that are coming to summer school, so they're coded, summer school, that's on my mind right now. After school, tutorials, they are coded, they are tracked. Because it is state comp ed money, we need to be able to show attendance and show performance on this. So yes, and I would say that the principals in the past used to start this after school tutorials in the spring semester. Now a majority of them are starting them even earlier. I think to what Dr. Jensen was saying, in some cases we call it learning gaps, but in many cases, it's missed learning because that learning that didn't happen. So yes, the principals are able to track it starting in the fall. Not everyone has the same amount of days. It is very strategic in what is needed. And this is a reoccurring item. It's for us to be able to show publicly how much of our state comp ed money is budgeted for this targeted group of students. It is for at-risk students, and it is above and beyond the expenses that are already allocated, whether it's Title I, whether it's the House Bill 4545, but it is a requirement that we do every year prior to adopting the budget. This is part of the discussion.
So we have outcomes for this in the fall, you said?
This is part of the work. At the end of the day, the outcome is our reading achievement that we have for third grade, our math achievement for third grade. This is part of the strategies that are being used, strategies being interventions during the day, strategies being after school. So this is all part of the strategy for that specific outcome.
So what I'm curious about is, like, I would like to, and I don't know, maybe the rest of the board doesn't, but I would like to see for the specific students that avail themselves of this particular program, I would like to see what their outcomes are. Like, are they passing their EOC so they can go ahead and march at the end of this? So I don't, if there's a way to see that data in the fall, I would like to see it.
We can certainly pull it. I cannot say that this specific
recognize-
strategy would be what made the difference, because for EOC, for example, they're also doing their own practice on Apex. They're doing 45-45, but we can certainly, because these students are tagged, we can certainly pull that data for them. And I see Dr. Parasol is making notes on it, so we'll get that data from our research and accountability team.
We recognize that there's multiple interventions occurring, and you never know just which one is going to make that student catch on. So we do recognize that, but it would be nice to see what the ROI we are yielding from this initiative. So thank you. At this time, I'll go ahead and call for the vote. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Ms. Westbrooks. Our next item is a public hearing for the 23-24 Spring Independent School District's budget. And at this time, I'll again ask Ms. Westbrook to continue.
Thank you, President Durant. Thank you. Thank you. Is it this one? Yes. Okay, so this is our official public hearing for the 2023-2024 budget. The notice of this public hearing was posted in the Houston Chronicle on June 14th. And as required, a summary of the budget was posted on the district's website under the financial transparency page on June 17th. So I wanted to begin our discussion, as we have begun our discussions throughout this budget process, just bringing attention back to the board and back to our community members and audience members of the point that our ESSER funds are going away. 23-24 is the final year for that. And that as we work through this $34 million deficit that we have, our goal is to avoid the fiscal cliff that is in front of us. So we've talked throughout the budget process about the fact that we are in a budget deficit and that we have two methodologies that would assist with balancing the budget. And that is, of course, increasing revenue or decreasing expenditures. And so we've talked about our focus, which has been on decreasing our expenditures through this process, particularly looking at staffing efficiencies, decreased services, and maximizing our federal funding. As we've discussed at the beginning at the May board meetings and then again on June 8th and on June 13th, the budget reductions that have been proposed that are included in this proposed budget this evening are listed here. And just beginning with, as I mentioned just a moment ago, maximizing our federal funding. And so we found funding available through our Title I funds that will allow us to reclassify some expenditures for about 3 years that will help us as we go through this budget reduction process. And then there's several other items that are listed here that, as I mentioned, we have discussed over the last 2 board meetings. And so this is the second part portion of that list, and you can see the total is $9,268,000. And as noted, that's included in the budget that we're proposing here this evening. Trustee Correa, who's not with us this evening, but she had made a request at one of our previous board meetings and said, is it possible for us to see the multi-year budget projection, particularly looking out over about a 5-year time period? And at that time, I said, it's pretty ugly. And so our goal is to ensure that this doesn't happen. And so what you're looking at here is starting with the proposed budget that we're here to do a public hearing on this evening, which is the 23-24 budget. So with our revenues, you'll see they remain consistent across the 5 years, because without an increase in our enrollment and an increase in our average daily attendance, which both weigh heavily on the amount of revenue that we bring in, we would assume our revenue is fairly constant. Because as we know, even though our property values go up, our tax compression requires that our tax rate goes down. And so we end up receiving about the same amount of funds. It just shifts which bucket of funds they're coming from, whether they're coming from local collections or if they're coming from the state. With the expenditures, what you see first is the baseline expenditures total amount. In 23-24, the additions that are listed there are the increase to the starting salary for our police officers, which we've discussed at each of our board meetings since we've been discussing the proposed budget. It also includes the addition of 9 police officers utilizing the House Bill 3 funds that were made available through this last legislative session. That $9.2 million in reductions that I just showed a moment ago. And so without the impact of ESSER for 23-24, we would have a fund balance of just over $77 million with a net deficit of $25.3 million. And it's important to focus on the deficit without ESSER, because that's the deficit that we have to be able to deal with, because that will be our budget when the ESSER dollars are going away. So with the fund balance of 77 million, and that's assuming that we end the 22-23 fiscal year with about $102 million fund balance. And of course, remember, fund balance is like it's our rainy day fund. So that's not something that we want to dip into on a regular basis. It's like when COVID hit and we were able to start purchasing our devices for our students. When we have those sorts of things, that's what our fund balance is really for. It's not for recurring expenditures, similar to a personal savings account. If you're paying your recurring bills out of your savings account, then eventually that savings account is going to be depleted. So if we take the methodology and move forward in 24-25, so as we've talked throughout this budget process, in total, we've identified $13.7 million of proposed reductions. The 9.2 is what was shown on the slide before. There's another 4.4 million that are proposed for 24-25. So if we take a 2% increase in our expenditures, and that 2% is inflationary cost, which we've talked about a lot, and we know that inflation is actually quite a bit more than 2% right now, but also if there were any type of compensation increases over the next year. So 2% is an assumption that we're using to create this projection. Then we would be looking at, in 24-25, a deficit budget of $27.4 million. So you would see our fund balance would drop considerably. And so, long story short, it would take about 3 to 4 years before we would completely deplete our fund balance if we do not make the adjustments that are necessary to adjust our expenditures to our revenue. And so, as mentioned earlier, there's opportunities to increase revenue as well, but we have much more control over our expenditures at this point in time. And then just as note that this does not include TRS on behalf, because we know that is just an accounting entry that impacts the revenue and the expenditures equally. So this is brought to you all in response to the request that we received from Trustee Correa, but also just to make sure that we're all understanding what the possibilities are without a change in our revenue, whether that's a legislative change in the future, or if there's a change in our revenue generators, which is our student population and our attendance. Otherwise, there's adjustments that continue to have to be made with our expenditures in order to get the budget back aligned.
Thank you for that, Ms. Westbrooks. And I do want to go on the record that both trustee Hodges and trustee Correa are online, but they're both been ill. Trustee Hodges had even been hospitalized. If you can keep her in your prayers. Thank you.
So
I
can we
wanted to
just pause
Yeah,
on this
because
one?
I wanted to comment on it because I know it looks bleak, but it's not unique to spring. I think a lot of districts are facing the same type of projection, and it just actually emphasizes the need to continue to look at opportunities to reduce our expenditures where we can. And there are going to be some tough decisions, and that's what this says is we're going to have to make some tough decisions.
I have a couple of questions. So, Trustee Correa asked for this. I'm curious for the revenue, and I recognize that like part of your way of working is to protect us. You sort of worst case scenario things and operate sort of conservatively, and that's kept us. I think that's how we got to our fund balance. I think largely because of your conservatism on the way we do this. But I wondered if we went back the previous 5 years along this continuum, would revenue remain flat in the other direction as well?
We have not had a lot of movement with our revenue, particularly because first we saw a dip in our enrollment, and then we saw a considerable dip in our attendance. So what I mentioned at the June 13th board meeting was that we did have the golden penny that everyone's saying, oh, we got this additional funding. Well, for spring, we didn't see it because we adjusted our average daily attendance to what we're actually seeing,
Right.
as opposed to budgeting for that higher attendance that hadn't been happening. Well, that decrease was largely offset by the increase in the golden penny yield. And so that's why we're looking at initially a $34 million deficit as opposed to a $40 million deficit.
Gotcha.
So it's offset. And so we had been fairly flat in our enrollment, even pre-pandemic. And when you're flat, you have to be very strategic with the way you manage your expenditures because you're not receiving additional revenue. And so that is how we've operated in the past, and the conservatism has worked well for us. But when you have a nosedive of 2,000 students in 1 year, and then about half of them come back, but then we're hit with the average daily attendance dropping by initially 6%. We were at 94%, and then last year we were at 88%. So at least now it's gone up to 91%. So that double whammy of loss of revenue and increasing expenditures along the way, that's why it's time to pause and adjust and readjust.
I understand.
Mhm.
I also seem to recall that the demographer projected enrollment increases over the next several years.
Minimal
Okay.
increases. And even pre-pandemic, when we received our enrollment projections, and I remember saying this over and over again because it helped me get my head wrapped around it, that it was going to take us 10 years just to get back to where we were in like 2014-15. And so even though there was an increase, it was such a small increase that it wasn't notable of any, other than the fact that it was going to take us that much time just to get back to our early days of attendance, or excuse me, of enrollment that we had in 2014-15. So there's nothing to look forward to in our projections, if that makes sense.
I still think, and I agree with her, this is useful to look at just in terms of a reality check for us and for the community to see like this is where it's headed, and we have to take proactive measures to not get to where we're in the red here. So thank you, Ms. Westbrooks.
Ms. Westbrooks, can you say one more time when it comes to the additions, what that refers to?
Yes, so when we were looking at the proposed budget, we had two line items. One was for the increase in the police starting pay to 60,000 to get to our surrounding districts, and that's 646,000. And the second amount was 653,000, and that was for the House Bill 3, the little bit of funding that we received in the legislative session related to safety and security. And so the change in the calculation went from $9.72 per ADA to $10 per ADA. So we got like $8,000 more, and then $15,000 per school. So that's how we got the 653. And so the House bill says that the district is supposed to have an officer at every single campus. Well, we can't afford that with those dollars, but we're able to at least get 9 additional officers that will move us towards that goal. So those two items added together, both related to safety and security, makes up that 1.3.
So the zero moving forward is just another assumption that we would not have
Well,
additions.
yes.
Or just that we don't know what the additions could be in the future. Am I saying that right?
Definitely,
Okay.
yes. So the additions that we have here became a part of the baseline budget going forward. So that 331 plus the 1.3 minus the 9.2 becomes your new baseline. And then we added 2% on that to get to the 329. So no additions unless we get to the next biennium and we get some
And then
additional
something
revenue.
else comes up. Okay, thank you.
And we did see, I'm sure you all heard that there was a second special call session today, but it's focused on property tax relief. There was no mention of any additional funding. Okay. If there are no additional questions, then we'll move towards the budget assumptions. And so this is a slide I know you've seen throughout the process with our projected enrollment at 34,265. We've talked about attendance and the fact that it's certainly not where we need it to be, but we've adjusted our budget to what it is. Our property growth is 12.4% year over year growth that we've seen. And then the maintenance and operations tax rate that we're using, this is under current law, is 0.7833. So a few things to note with this asterisk here. Number one is that we receive a second estimate of our property values, a certified estimate in July. That estimate is what is used to actually set the maximum compressed tax rate. Depending on what happens at the legislative session and the special session, we could have something on the ballot in November that would either increase the homestead exemption or something that could change the maximum compressed rate percentage. Those are all things that we'll talk about after we come back in August, September, based on what we know. But right now, under current law, and this budget is calculated based on that 0.7833. The other thing to note is that, just as I mentioned before, it doesn't change the total amount. It just changes where we get the funds, whether we get them locally or whether we get it through the state. So the proposed budget is we're required, you as the Board of Trustees are required to pass 3 budgets: the general fund, debt service, and child nutrition. And so general fund, of course, is the budget that we have spent the whole entire budget season discussing and preparing for. And so the general fund budget, including TRS on behalf, is $344,802,428. The debt service budget, which we know is the budget that takes care of our debt service payments, the bond, those payments, is $76,560,058. And then child nutrition is a federal fund, but is a fund that we're required to have a budget passed on. Our child nutrition team gives us that budget, and it's $33,942,000 for a total district operating budget of $455,304,486. And so all the other information that you have regarding our other budgets are there for information purposes, and of course they support the district, but statutorily we're required to pass this operating budget that includes those 3 funds. And so I wanted to also, as required, mention those federal funds just a little bit more here. And so we have the ESSA, which is elementary and secondary ESSA. And there's Title I, Title II, Title III, and Title IV. And then, of course, we've spent a lot of time talking through ESSER II and ESSER III. And we know ESSER II sunsets September 30th of this year. And as mentioned earlier, ESSER III sunsets September of 2024. And so we do have our Assistant Superintendent of Federal and State Programs, Ms. Kelly Klein, is here with us this evening if there are any specific questions about the federal programs.
I think ESSA is every student succeeds.
Thank you. Every student
Every student succeeds
Act.
Act.
There you go.
It
Thank
used
you.
to be No Child Left Behind, and now it's Every Student Succeeds.
Yes. With the acronym ESSER now, I start saying ESSA, but then I find myself in ESSER. So thank you for that assist. And so here's the third and final year of ESSER. Again, this is a budget that we've looked at early on throughout the budget process, but this is the final dollars that we have allocated for the ESSER 3 budget. The first part is that supplanting expenditures of 22.3, which is helping offset the general fund for that final year. We have several positions that are funded through ESSER that has helped our campuses throughout the pandemic. And those dollars are being sunset on September 30th of 2024. The Kelly Services that we've talked about a lot throughout this budget process as well is funded through ESSER 3, that 1.5 million. And so that service again as well would go away when that funding source goes away. And then you'll see several of the programs that we have been able to fund through the ESSER dollars. So as we're going through our process, we've already begun those discussions about what other funding sources do we have to pick up some of these costs, and then what's going to have to sunset when the dollars go away. So that is the ESSER 3 budget for the third and final year. And that is actually the last thing that I have as it relates to the proposed budget.
Did we appropriate for the Kelly Services expenditure?
Only here in the ESSER 3 budget, but not in the general fund budget. General fund still pays for the sub. ESSER 3 is paying for the administrative cost of getting those subs to us. And so that's what's budgeted here, that 1.5 million.
I thought it was our intent to only budget it through ESSER 2, that we were not carrying it into another year.
ESSER 2 or year 2?
We were not extending the contract another year.
Yeah, that was my understanding. We were not renewing with Kelly. So my broader concern with that is, especially now that we have Dr. King, is our capacity to administer our own substitute program. And I recognize that will be a transition period, and I would rather use that money to sort of assist with that than to continue to lean on Kelly Services for that.
And good evening, trustees. Trustee Adams, my concern is right now is that we don't have a substitute office, and having a substitute teacher in front of kiddos greatly assists in academic outcomes when we don't have a sub. And so the numbers that I've been studying before, that we were at about 30% sub fill rate before Kelly Services, and that right now we're experiencing about a 70% fill rate. Taking that away right now without having geared up a substitute office and really recruited subs and going out and really build a sub pool concerns me with being able to, with our fill rates for finding subs for positions. Now, however, I do believe that, we have to, next year that we will, because we will not have Kelly Services, that we will, but I think it just our due diligence to staff up and to be able to really build a solid sub pool of our own.
How long do you anticipate? So you think that by the following year, we would be able to sort of spin up and be able to do that?
Yes, that is our goal. Our goal is that during the 23-24 school year, we start building our sub office, we start recruiting our own subs, our own sub pool to be ready for the start of the 24-25 school year, where we are managing our own sub program.
My larger concern is that we were very clear we had no intention on continuing with Kelly Services. So my larger concern is, why are we even here discussing it?
Mr. Ant, we can certainly look at it. This contract is a middle of the year contract. We actually, I believe, discussed it in January. I see Dr. McKeithen nodding her head, because the board had given the district the go-ahead back in back in the fall of 2021. We did not activate this contract until January of 2022, and that's when we came to, talk through it. And so this is that last year that we have funding for, and that was the discussion. The message was very clear that we did not want to continue with it, but it was a middle of the year contract that we approved, and this will give the HR department the opportunity to, stand up our own substitute department. And it goes back to the great teacher shortage that we have. Prior to bringing on Kelly Services in January of 22, our fill rate was at 30%. There were no substitutes to be found. Teachers were having to take in classes. They were being split. It was not good. Kelly Services has gotten us up sometimes as high as 88% fill rate. And I can assure you that the teachers and the principals welcome this, and they know and understand that this will be going away and that the district will have to stand this up. But going into this new year with the continued teacher shortage, we had this discussion. It was approved for one more year. It is
We had this
funded through
discussion.
ESSER 3, though, not ESSER 2. Is that correct, Ms. Westbrook?
That's correct. It's funded through ESSER 3. And so I don't want to, I know that we had a lot of concerns about ESSER, about the Kelly Services contract. And I know that it was said that we didn't want to continue the ESSER, or excuse me, the Kelly Services contract beyond the funding availability. So we are in the contract. It's July. We're in it until January. So if we began the conversation anytime after January, we were already contractually obligated to them. So when it comes up for renewal in January of 2024, are we saying mid-year that we want that service to go away?
I'll just comment this. At the time, the district informed us that it was a 2-year contract. When I questioned the Kelly Services gentleman sitting right here, he said it was a year-to-year contract. It was a lot of conversation, and it was very clear that we did not want to continue with Kelly Services. At this point, though, we can't put our HR department in a position to try to do something about it before school starts. So I'm disappointed because what the board asked for didn't occur. But we have to do what's best for kids. I would like a survey, though, done of teachers around the quality of the subs that are coming in. I understand that from the principal's perspective, we need someone in the classroom, but the quality of subs that are coming in from Kelly Services, to my knowledge, have not been the quality that we would want in our classrooms. So I'd like to see a survey to verify that. But I think we're in a catch-22 at this point.
I would also just sort of add, like, my understanding from that conversation with the representative from Kelly Services, we were the only district in the region, I think, that were utilizing that service. I do believe in spring. And so if all our surrounding districts can figure out a way to get their substitute fill rates, I have that expectation of our district.
So as a point of clarification, as we move forward, are we saying that we absolutely want to cancel the contract come January 2024? So just to make sure that we're abundantly clear on that.
Dr. King, do you think by January you could have a department or the people that you need in place to start to transition us in January?
Yes, as long as, one of the questions I have is about if Kelly Services manages the filling, or because it would also require us going out to bid to find another frontline product or sub-finder product to be able to manage the electronic, the filling and of the vacancies. Having the teachers call in. So that's my other worry is that.
We still have it. We still have frontline. We still have ASOP under
We still have
contract.
ASOP. Okay.
Mhm.
Having said that, I guess the board needs to decide this, but I have had reservations about that from the very beginning. And so to my mind, the sooner we are self-sufficient as it relates to having our subs in place, that the better, as far as I'm concerned.
I just wanted to put in my 2 cents because perhaps I've been too quiet in the past. I remember distinctly us talking about, and I appreciate your general philosophy that if we can do these functions within the district, we should be doing it within the district. Absolutely, I'm with you there. However, I don't remember as a board we ever made a vote or came to a consensus because I was unsure at the time. I can tell you I wasn't one who was with canceling them immediately. So I just want to put that in. Sometimes when I don't speak, it doesn't mean I agree.
I understand our situation now as to your need for them not having an appropriate trained team to be able to do that quickly starting in September. That's quite understandable. So I would be in favor of letting them continue through January. But in terms of renewing the contract in January, no, I don't think we should. So I think we should put a lot of eggs in place to make sure that we are ready to handle this in January.
And that's an up to the amount contract. And so I'm wondering if there's a possibility to use some of those funds to assist Dr. King with standing up that department. So that you would have to figure that out. But my understanding is the 1.5 million is just, if we had to use subs every day, all constantly, we might get up and then you'd be coming back and asking for additional. But that also leaves open the possibility that through other initiatives and getting our enrollment up, that we could figure out a way to use those resources for something else.
I had a couple of questions on page 12. What is the 1 million supply and material cost for innovation and equity covering? These are questions sent by Trustee Correa.
Okay, so we can talk through that, but I also wanted to note that the board members received a document, a binder in May that had every one of the non-salary budgets in there, line by line. And so that information is the binder that you received. It's all the non-salary, but I'll let Dr. Parasoff, if you wanted to speak to that.
What's the line item again? I apologize.
It's supplies and materials. And so that's going to be inclusive of research and accountability, college and career readiness. It's all of those together.
Page 12, the 1 million supply and material cost for innovation and equity. And maybe
What page number is that on, Ms. Westbrooks?
It's in the binder. It's page 12.
Yes,
It's just,
yes.
it's lumped together. On this, it's a summary. So it's on page 12 towards the bottom. But Dr. Parasol, that's going to be college and career readiness. So we've got some software systems that are included there.
That answers it.
We have, and CCMR,
Yeah.
research and accountability. There's several that are mixed in with innovation and equity.
Yes. And a lot of that, it does go to our CCMR work in college and career military readiness, as well as work for providing opportunities for students. I know we had some software with scholarships to help connect students with universities and scholarship opportunities.
It also includes all the testing that we do, all the screening. Out of this budget, we take out the map. So it's all of the screeners. And I think the best way to be able to look at what that stands for is if you look at the detailed budget, that binder, and under the tab of innovation, you'll have all the different departments that Dr. Parasol oversees, and then just look at the that line item for each one.
Justifications.
Yes.
And so
We'll list all of them.
SAT testing, ACT testing, the different programs that we pull out of like Eduphoria, district-wide is covered from there. Qualtrics, which we do our surveys through, is covered through there. I mentioned already the work from the college career counselors. It's quite significant. Even work with our AP and college board testing comes through there.
I'm just remembering the binder that you're talking about. Did anybody else bring their binder with them?
It was a big one.
Yeah, okay, okay.
There is so much data here. I don't have a page number or a hint somewhere. I never did get it. I haven't seen over 100 pages. So anyway.
Okay, but that's the detail behind the non-salary budget for all of the departments. Yes, ma'am.
On page 15, the 7% budget that goes to contracted services, is that 7% normal?
It is, and if you compare it to the current year, it was 7.4%. This year it's 7.6%. And so contracted services, that includes our utilities. That's the largest part of contracted services, is utilities. But you can see in the comparison 22, 23 to 23, 24, the percentages are spot on. Yes, ma'am.
Spot on. Thank you. Did you have questions, Dr. Jensen?
I just have one more. Can you remind me, what does capital outlay refer to?
So anything that's over $5,000 is considered capital outlay. So if we purchase a vehicle, a police vehicle, that's capital outlay. Mhm. Our campuses like to budget for, if they want to buy a new chair or something, they'll put it in capital outlay. We move it over to supplies, but that's how they tend. So if you see like 1,000 on a campus, that's what that is. But if you're looking district-wide, typically it's the bigger stuff. And that's why you'll see, like when we were doing the portable buildings over at Marshall, that's where we had those funds, which is why you see it drop so much from last year to this year.
That was my next question. Okay, thank you.
So I shared with the team some resources, and I don't know if you have seen it, Ms. Westbrooks, but it's a primer produced by the Georgetown Edgenomics Lab about budgeting and sort of like how to deal with the ESSER cliff. And so I just want to encourage everybody, if you have an opportunity, I sent a video out earlier today to take a look at that. It sort of informs how districts across the country are dealing with this issue, because it is a nationwide issue. Everybody's approaching the ESSER cliff, and I think we largely have done a better job of managing it than most, but we still, I think we can learn some stuff.
And I did want to add, another big chunk of those funds do go for dual credit courses. So all of that, as we expand our associate's degree and dual credit programs, that covers those fees to Lone Star College.
Any more questions? About a minute before we call for a vote. Well, we're wrapping up the public hearing. If there are not any additional questions for Ms. Westbrooks or any of the senior leadership team this evening, I'll entertain a motion.
President Durant, I move that the Board of Trustees approve and adopt the 2023-2024 Spring Independent School District budget.
Second that motion.
Been moved by trustee McDaniel and seconded by trustee Newhouse that the Board of Trustees approve and adopt the 2023-2024 Spring Independent School District budget. Additional questions?
Discussion. And Chief Westbrooks, we do amend this budget as we go forth.
Absolutely. Our first amendment will come to the board in October. Yes,
Thank you.
ma'am. Thank you. Mhm.
Well, I do want to thank Ms. Westbrooks and her staff. This board has had a lot of questions. It's been a long month, and we appreciate all of your support and your hard work.
Thank you for that. And quite a few of the finance team is here this evening, so they heard it firsthand. Thank you.
Yes, we appreciate you. We all want to stand up. Y'all want us
Yes,
to hurry up
please
and
stand.
vote, right?
Stand up. Thank you. I did also want Ms. Westbrooks to mention, and I know Dr. King will talk about it in the compensation manual when he presents that, a caveat that we've included there. But we do realize and understand that this budget is a very difficult budget. I see Ms. Thomas here, and she always, is a reminder from us, for me personally, that we never forget our teachers. And this is our first budget. And I know that's what is, weighing on everyone's heart, that this is our very first budget that we will not, aside from the stipend that the board already approved, who retained our high quality teachers, and especially those teachers with more years of experience and have dedicated their time here to Spring ISD, that loyalty stipend is amazing. Aside from that, this budget does not have any salary increases. And so I wanted Ms. Westbrooks to talk about that as far as the caveat that we are addressing coming up in our compensation manual. But I do want you to talk through it here because I want our teachers and our staff to know that we understand and we wholeheartedly support all the work that our staff does, our employees do every single day. It is just a very tough budget for us. You have seen the deficit that we have, and we must do something about it. But know that the administration, and most importantly, this board, values every single employee. And we recognize that it's difficult, but want to know want everyone to know that this board and this administration fully supports our employees. And Ms. Westbrooks, can you talk a little bit about what we have put and want the board to approve for us?
Sure. So as you recall early on when we were talking through the legislative updates, that there was a finance vehicle that was House Bill 100 that had some additions to the basic allotment and some funding mechanisms that would actually add new money to school districts. And so we know that failed. And so the regular session ended with no change to funding. However, just as the special session was called today, we've heard that there's a possibility for another special session that'll be called at a later date that will come back and address maybe some of those things that were left on the table. We also know that with an increase in the basic allotment, the law requires that there's an automatic increase in compensation specifically for teachers, nurses, librarians, and counselors. So the compensation manual that Dr. King will present later has some language in there that allows for the board to come back and make those updates and those additions to compensation if the funding becomes available. Because we're hearing as late as September that something could happen as late as September. Now we know we don't hang our hat on that, but it gives us the ability to come back and make that mid-year increase if and when those funds are made available.
So part of what I have learned recently is that systems across this country, when on the rare occasion that we do get additional funding from whatever source, whether it's the feds or the state, it has kind of become a tradition that we take that extra funding and we add staff. And what the state is trying to do by having that provision is to force us into acting a different way, and a way that the research suggests would be better for the system, which is instead of adding a bunch of extra underpaid bodies, take the experienced, high-performing bodies that we have and pay them more, which is something that, as we do potentially some painful cuts next year, I think we want to keep that in mind and figure out a way to systematize that when we get that extra funding, it goes into the pockets of our people, the people that are here. So
I think that point's being made too through the teacher incentive allotment, and that there's creating opportunities not to your point, add FTEs, but to make sure that the ones that are here are being paid quite a bit, you know, if they're having successful outcomes.
And that's the right thing to do. And I'm really proud of all the hard work that the board has put in. I know I've been on this board a long time, and this is a really dedicated board that wants to do the right thing, that requests a lot of data and questions. I know sometimes that can feel uncomfortable, but I think it comes from a sense and a commitment. We are trustees because we have been trusted by the community to do what's best for their kids and in the school. And I think as we partner together, our senior leadership team has that same commitment. You know, we all always put the kids first, and we can't go wrong, right? Any other comments before I call for the vote? Actually going to do a roll call vote. For those in favor to pass the budget, Trustee Adams?
Aye.
Thank you. Trustee Jensen?
Aye.
Trustee Newhouse?
Aye.
Trustee McDaniel?
Aye.
And I vote aye for a unanimous decision on the 23-24 Spring ISD District budget. Thank you, Ms. Westbrooks. You can continue. You're still not done yet.
Thank you so much. It's going to take me just a moment here to get our next presentation up. But while we're doing that, I did want to bring Geraldine Mosley, our Director of Purchasing, forward to assist me with this presentation, as well as Jeremy Binkley, our General Counsel, will assist us as well. Well, technology assists there, teamwork. Okay, so the board was first introduced to the Harris County funded disparity study in September of 2022. So we're here this evening because we're moving forward to the next steps. In September, you all gave us the ability to move forward at that time and actually start the process to take advantage of those funds that were available to participate in the disparity study. So this evening, we're just going to come back with a recap and just talk through the purpose of the study, the key components, the common findings and recommendations of studies that have happened in the past, the funding opportunity that we have through Harris County, and then the timeline of everything that needs to take place. So the purpose of a disparity study is to measure whether or not Spring ISD's current policies have produced an equitable environment with equitable outcomes for our vendors, and that our vendors were provided a full and fair opportunity to contract with Spring ISD regardless of their size. And then to determine the degree to which Spring has been successful in providing opportunities for those outcomes through the collection and the analysis of evidence. Based on the disparity studies that have been done in the past, we recognize that there are some key components. And so the first component is defining the market. So what market are we operating in? Where are we buying our goods and services? And then, of course, to also assess the availability of that market to minority and women business enterprises. So we refer to them as MWBEs. So are those companies able to access Spring ISD's business through the market environment? And so just making sure everybody's with me. You have your copy? Yes. Okay. And so also, in order to make this happen, it's an analysis that's needed, and there's a comparison of the vendors that we've used in the past. And usually the way to do that is to look back over about 3 to 5 years and see which vendors the district has utilized and compare those vendors to see whether or not there's been an equitable access to the district's business. Now, something that's of note is that the last 3 years we've been in COVID. So the last 3 years may not look the same as when we go back prior to the COVID years. However, with that 3 to 5 years, we should be able to capture not only the operations during COVID, but some of the time before that. And so ultimately, the study should provide us with some findings as well as some recommendations based on the evidence that they find that will say, what do we need to do going forward to address any disparities through race or gender or anything of that nature that is discovered as a part of the disparity study. So based on some of the common findings in disparity studies, the recommendations that they've had have been making changes that are geared towards providing access and information to vendors and making contracting adjustments that help those businesses. And adjustments could look like things such as reducing the limits on insurance, on bonding, and things of that nature. Possibly dividing up larger contracts into smaller contracts that allow different vendors to take advantage of those big projects. Of course, that would be when it's possible and when it's appropriate. And it could go as far as the district researching and providing information as far as financial assistance for these companies to access capital so that they can fully operate. And then also tracking our MWBE participation, the number of vendors that we use that fall in that category, that sort of thing. So regarding those common recommendations, some of the notable remedies are listed here. And so that includes things such as adopting a formalized MWBE program and having policies and procedures as to how we administer that program, determining what certification standards are needed and declare what's an accepted certified agency to say that a company is an MWBE, making sure that we put forth good faith efforts in expanding access to the district's programs, setting goals for our MWBE program. Additional remedies could include things such as either waiving retainage, which we know when we're in construction projects, retainage is that amount that we retain or hold back until the project is complete and everyone is on the same page as far as the satisfaction of the program. So waiving the retainage requirement or releasing that retainage a little earlier could help those companies who may not have as much capital available. And as I mentioned, also possibly adopting if and when that MWBE program may be up for review or sunset in the future. So as mentioned, there's an opportunity with the disparity study through Harris County to receive funding to pay for the study to a total of $200,000. And we would conduct the study in collaboration through an interlocal agreement, not only with Harris County so that we could have access to that funding that's available, but also working alongside Aldine ISD and Alief ISD so that we can work together to manage our cost and make it beneficial for all three of the districts. Upon approval from the board and with the interlocal agreements that are necessary, we would receive funding to pay for the vendor based on an established percentage. So upon award, like once we establish that interlocal agreement with Harris County and we've found the vendor that would conduct the disparity study, which of course that vendor would be selected through a request for proposal, an RFP process, which Spring ISD would actually lead for all three districts. So we would get 50% of the funds up front once that's executed and we get that notice to proceed from Harris County. Then we would receive an additional 25% once the study is done and that report has been provided to the district. 15% of the award upon completion of the final report, and then 10% once we look at all the requirements of the program, and if Spring has followed all of the guidelines, then we would be able to access that final 10% to finish off. And so with that intro, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Mosley, who is going to walk us through what that timeline looks like.
Good evening, everyone. So this timeline shows where we've come from and where we're going should we choose to approve this RFP for the disparity study. With your approval, we'll move forward with engaging with Harris County. Based on last September, we began engaging with them based on your approval at that time. Now, with your approval today, we will move forward with preparing for the solicitation during the month of July and gather solicitation documents and have them reviewed by our collaborating districts, that being Aldine ISD and Alief ISD. In August, we would plan to post that RFP for the disparity study vendor. And upon receiving those proposals, we, including again those collaborating districts, will evaluate and score the proposal and most likely have those vendors in for presentations. A recommendation would be made to this board in November with the final selection for that vendor that we've selected or recommended. Each district's board will enter into separate contracts with the awarded vendor. And then over the next 11 months, we will work with that vendor to make payments to them for meeting milestones based on our agreement per Harris County's payment to us.
Ms. Mosley, I'd like to ask Ms. Westbrooks to advance the slides. Is it, you have it?
Yes.
There we go.
So
I was
sorry.
like, that's okay. I know they're kind of faint, but
Okay.
thank you.
So we are in November now, where we've awarded the disparity study and then moving on to working with that vendor in order to complete the study. So contractually, we'll have until June 2024 for the vendor to complete the study and make their recommendations to us. And then in these, I can't see it. In December, the resulting action, we would present that to the board after the disparity study is complete and their recommendations have been provided to us, and then we would come back to the board to share what our program would be at that time.
I would add that December is a maximum time frame that we have to do it based on the contract with the county. We actually could have, we would be working through governance committee on policies, depending on the recommendations that came out of the disparity study. And I believe we have 3 months to do that under the contract. And then we would be bringing those to the board. And it does give that time for 2 readings of policies and those pieces. And so just as an added.
Questions? Who would be the project manager on this and who would create the RFP? If Spring ISD is in charge of this, I'm thinking you need to hire another person.
So I would be lead along with my executive director, Philip Ellison. We also would engage with other entities that have already gone through the solicitation process or have a program in place. Entities like Prairie View A&M University as well as Lone Star, they've already gone through the solicitation process, and so we would seek their guidance and support in going through that as well.
I'm just saying this takes time.
Yes.
And effort. And I don't think you all, just have spare time sitting around in your office that, gee, I'd like to spend the next week creating an RFP and putting this out. Also, you have to follow up with this entity who's going to be doing this study. And you have to have people on staff who can actually evaluate if this is a high-quality research organization, because we're into a new era. This is not student learning here. This isn't a safer school for our students. We're into now a different level of evaluating our own practices. And I'm just saying that this is new territory. I don't want you to underestimate the time and talent it takes to do this well. I think we just think that you get the $200,000 and you just hire somebody and go through our normal RFP process. And it could be a real mess if we do it that way.
I had noted when I was going through this, Ms. Mosley, that we had somehow become the lead district on this, and I wondered, I couldn't find it, but I wondered if we had negotiated any extra consideration for basically using more of our resources to participate in this.
I think as part of the conversations, I believe we actually volunteered to be the lead. We wanted to have that additional ability to make sure that this was being done to the standards of Spring ISD. Aldine ISD, Alief ISD, wonderful districts, wonderful people, but we knew that this was important to our board and to our district and to our community. And so, Philip Ellison had no problem jumping in and saying, look, we'll take the lead on this so that we can make sure this happens and it happens well. We have an amazing procurement team, and I have every faith that they have the resources to make this happen. And we will certainly have support from the 2 other districts. This is not all going to fall on Spring ISD's shoulders. They'll be part of the evaluation committee. They'll have input into creating the RFP. Like I said, they also have very talented teams, but I know Mr. Ellison really took an interest in making sure that we had that additional level of I don't want to say control, but of leadership.
And that's the initial, the creating the RFP, leading the charge with evaluating the RFP. To Dr. Jensen's point, the last bullet point that we have up here is that if we do, the results of the study comes back and the action is determined that we move forward with creating a hub program, an MWBE program, that would definitely require additional staff within the procurement department because it is quite a bit of an undertaking. So at that point, that's why we made sure it was on the slide because we know we would need an additional, at least one additional FTE to administer that program. But to Mr. Binkley's point, as far as the RFP and leading that portion of the study, we feel comfortable that our team can handle that in-house.
And I don't believe
I
there'll
do
be.
think we want to talk as a board on what direction we take. I do know that one of our partners, A-Leaf, has assigned a disparity study committee that has a couple board members and other staff on there. So that's how they're managing the process. So
So would that look like an ad hoc in addition to our standing, or would you add that to?
not saying that's what we want to do. I just think we need to look at all our options, what level of participation we're having, how our collaborative districts are managing it in their house. So
That leads to one of my questions about us being the lead agency. Again, wonderful districts. Should, however, the other districts not complete whatever it is that they need to complete, would then fall on us, or how does that work?
And so that lead is basically with creating the RFP, getting it out there and getting it reviewed. We have built into the agreement, so there's two interlocals in your packet. There's an interlocal with Harris County. There's an interlocal then among the three districts. And there are pieces built into that to protect us from any particular district dropping the ball or not doing their fair share of the work. Once the RFP has been published and a vendor chosen by all three districts, then it's really going to be incumbent on each district to do their own piece of getting the data to the vendor. That it's not for us to get Aldine's data to the vendor or A-Leaf's data to the vendor. It's on us to get our data to the vendor. We will have a separate contract with the vendor. A-Leaf will have their own and Aldine will have their own. And so at that point, it really is all three districts working separately, but the vendor is able to consolidate some of the analysis that would need to happen as far as getting the demographic data of the different vendors, being so close geographically. There's going to be a lot of overlap in the vendors that the three districts are using. And so rather than having companies do separate analyses of those demographics for three different schools, they can do a lot of that analysis together, and we can save some money that way. But our results would be our results. They would look at our use of vendors, the demographics of those vendors, and all of the other pieces that are part of the study to give us a Spring ISD specific recommendation.
The biggest benefit is saving us money.
It's allowing the money that the county has allotted to go farther. Early on in the conversations, there was some concern whether $200,000 is enough to do a disparity study, and none of the districts want to be on the hook for another $300,000 or $400,000. By doing it this way, we're able to see the benefit of that overlap and stretch that $200,000 a lot farther to help make sure that we're not seeing additional cost as part of the study to the vendor. We will see additional cost with potential programs that we have to implement and other pieces, but as far as making sure that the vendor's charges don't go above our allotted amount, this does help us stretch that money.
So am I seeing that it is possible for all three districts to have three different vendors?
No.
No,
That's not possible.
that is not the intent.
The intent is that we would collaborate with one another and make a decision on one vendor, and then that one vendor would have a contract with each individual district.
Now, if we were at a standstill and all three districts were dead set on three different vendors, well, then we would probably have to terminate that interlocal and hope that we don't exceed our $200,000 for the vendor we chose. I do think though, all three districts are very motivated to do this study. In having the conversations with all three districts and the different personnel that have been part of those conversations, I'm confident that we're all on the same page here.
So let me back up and understand, what are the vendors? What are we looking for a vendor? Is there a project that we have specifically, each one of us, each district? What is this vendor going to be used for?
So
What's
they'll
the
actually,
project?
the vendor will actually conduct the disparity study. And so we would select one vendor and they would do the disparity study for Spring, for Aldine, and for A-Leaf. And so each one of us will receive our own separate report based on the data that they've reviewed from Spring ISD and the evidence that they've gotten. We would each get our own separate report, but the vendor would conduct the disparity study for each of our districts.
I like that one vendor to do that.
Yes.
But once they have given us the results, at what point do we carry on for them? Do we carry on after that?
Yes.
Because I would think Aldine would go their separate way, A-Leaf would go
Correct.
theirs.
And we do.
we would
That's the intent.
do out. It's not that,
We're not then creating programs
Okay.
That are the same. Our results may be vastly different from Aldine's results. Our recommendations may be vastly different, and we would implement what we as a district need to implement based on those recommendations and results without regard to Aldine or A-Leaf. At that point, the districts would all three have gone their separate ways.
Exactly. That's where we split off. We have that 12 months from the start of the program. We have 12 months to complete the study. And at that point, to Mr. Binkley's point, we split apart. And then Aldine takes their results, Spring takes their results, and we developed Spring's action plan.
So I would say by collaborating and letting that one vendor do the study for all three districts, that's where we're saving cost. Because we're partnering together, and like Mr. Binkley pointed out, we have the same demographics, we have the same people that they'll be studying. So at that point though, once that's completed, then that's when we would do our own separate action plan, or whatever our outcomes are from the findings.
Yes, and even
And
during.
at that point, that's when we're looking at additional staffing.
Correct. And even during the study, there will be some transition of the split, right? So the big thing here is if those of us right here are all the vendors of the three districts, you're gonna have some overlap. Geraldine and I may be vendors for all three districts. Dr. Pariseau and Dr. King may be vendors for only two of the districts. Well, the heavy lift for this study is really getting the demographic data and looking at the amount of money and work that is provided to all these different vendors. Because if you're not tracking that demographic data for the vendors already and have that, then they have to go back and rebuild all of that. But in rebuilding those essentially databases of vendor demographics, they're able to save time and effort by taking those overlapping vendors, and that goes into all three databases, right, for each. So you're not rebuilding it 3 times for those vendors, you're rebuilding it once for those vendors. But then where Dr. Pariseau may be a vendor for 1 or 2 districts, he only goes in those 2 districts' databases, essentially. I'm simplifying it, but that's where that overlap, that's where that cost savings comes in. But we are providing them with our own data. They are looking specifically at our use of those vendors to provide us recommendations and results. And so our results and recommendations are specifically for Spring ISD. And so that's why I say there is already a transitional split between the 3 districts at that point, because we're getting specific results from a contract that we have directly with the vendor and without the other districts.
I'm still concerned about that staffing thing because these are all cogent, wonderful arguments, but that was only $200,000. And I've just spent a good amount of time looking at all the salaries here in Spring ISD and the things that we're doing trying to reduce the salaries. And here I'm seeing easily, if we had a full-time person and they might need an assistant, we're talking about maybe a third of this $200,000 just going to a person who manages it from the school district end.
So the $200,000 actually can't be used for any internal staffing or internal costs. It can only be used to pay the vendor. As far as creating the RFP, that's no bigger of a lift right now than if we were just doing this disparity study on our own. But depending on what those results are and the programs that need to be implemented as determined by the board, there may be some additional staffing needs at that point, depending on the programs, and that would have to factor into some of the decisions that are made by the board and the administration.
And I go back one more time, it's not helping student learning, it's not helping student safety. I'm very worried about this at this time.
I just want to name that there is a public engagement piece here. Should we approve that the community is able to go and follow along with the process. It'll be on the website. There's the contact person will be there. And also just thinking about our meeting last month where there were members of the community who came that were concerned when it comes to, for our public participation, who are concerned about ensuring that our community is represented and has access to projects and services so that the people who are supporting our district are representative of our district. And so I think that is important to note. For the reason behind the study is that legally, this is the process we have to take in order to identify if there's any disparities when it comes to equity. So we stand on equity. We read our equity statement. We have an equity committee. It's a part of our pillars. And so this is a part of the process to ensure that we are systematically following on what we say we believe in.
That well, because everybody else's light went off.
I want to caution everybody that speakers who speak to us sometimes have incomplete information or they have misunderstood information as well as sometimes very accurate information. And unless we go and explore what they've said, obviously there was a concern there. Absolutely, there's a concern there. But if we're going to be collecting all this data ourselves to give to somebody else, I'm not sure it's at this time with the budget that we're trying to deal with why we can't really go and do some fact finding ourselves. I'm just very concerned at this point. I'm undecided.
I think that's the beauty of the study. As Natasha said, it's the legal requirement. The Supreme Court says we have to do this. But people do come and people say all sorts of things. So having a third party actually verify whether there is a need or not, we may get back the findings of the study and determine that there absolutely is no need, but you don't know until you do the study. So
Now that's a convincing argument.
She said that's a convincing argument. Ms. Westbrook, sir?
No, ma'am, I believe that's all we had to share with you all. And as Ms. Mosley and Mr. Binkley mentioned, there's 2 interlocal agreements that will require action. The first is with Harris County to become a part of the study and utilize the funding available. And the second is for that collaboration with Alief ISD, who's taken theirs to their board this evening, and with Aldine ISD, who has already obtained approval for their interlocal agreement.
Thank you. So I'll now entertain a motion from the Board of Trustees to approve the interlocal agreement between Harris County and Spring ISD.
Madam President, I move that the Board of Trustees approve the interlocal agreement between Harris County and Spring ISD.
Second.
It's been moved by trustee Newhouse and seconded by trustee Adams that the board approve the interlocal agreement between Harris County and Spring ISD. Is there any additional discussion? All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Ms. Westbrook. You can continue.
Oh, I think there's one more motion, right?
We
Yes,
have to
there's
do the
two
second one.
interlocal
That's
agreements.
right.
Mhm.
I'll entertain the second motion.
President Durant, I move that the Board of Trustees approve the interlocal agreement among Spring ISD, Aldine ISD, and Alief ISD.
Second.
It's been moved by trustee McDaniel and seconded by trustee Newhouse that the board approve the interlocal agreement between Spring ISD, Aldine ISD, and Alief ISD to cooperate for the procurement and contracting for disparity study vendor. Do we have any discussion? Call for the vote. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. For our next item, I'd like to recognize our Chief of Human Resources, Dr. Terrell King.
Yes, good evening, again, President Durant, Dr. Hinojosa, and members of the Board of Trustees. First agenda item I have for you tonight is our 2023-2024 staffing guidelines. In your agenda packet, you have a one-pager describing the changes, which are minimal, to the document this year. The changes, first change resulted just as kind of a cleanup. This past school year, the financial services team, as long as our human resources team, sat down to make sure that this was actually a document that reflected what we were doing in practice. And so it involved matching the staffing guidelines document to position control. And so that work has been done. It includes the addition of 9 police officers as a result of the funding from House Bill 3, which we spoke about during our budget adoption. And then I believe the board had a conversation in March about increasing staffing allocation ratios at the various levels for elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. And it also reflects the position eliminations that were reflected in the budget that was approved earlier this evening.
Are you ready for questions?
Yes.
I want to tell you that this was one of the most complete reports. And at some point in it, I ran across you, went through definitions. I really appreciated and highlighting the changes and that sort of thing, but I do have a few questions.
Yes.
On page 81 and 82, 83. On most of these schools, they would list the number of regular classroom teachers, but I'm not seeing it on Roberson. Like on page 83 for the SLA, midway down the page under state compensatory education, it says regular classroom teachers, that there's 16 of them. But I don't see that on the Roberson one. What am I not seeing?
I can
here?
help with that one. So Robertson Middle School is actually, it's 800 students, and so we staff that campus at the regular middle school ratio of 30-1, which is kind of in the middle of page 81. And then they receive some additional staffing above that. For example, underperforming in visual arts, since they're a specialty campus, they have, in addition to their 30-1, the piano teacher, guitar teacher, those sorts of things. But their base teacher allocation is based on the middle school staffing ratio of 30-1. Whereas with Spring Leadership Academy and some of the smaller campuses, they get a set amount, because if we staff them at 30-1, they wouldn't have enough teachers.
Oh,
Yes, ma'am.
okay.
They're small.
Next question I have is on page 96. Under high school, there's a percussion teacher. Does this poor person have to go from high school to high school?
I believe.
On page 96, at the bottom of the page, under high school?
Yes, each high school, each of the comprehensive high schools have their own a percussion teacher.
So there's a lot of drummers and.
Yes. So the percussion teacher works hand in hand with the band director.
So it's not just one for the whole district?
No, ma'am. It's one at Spring, one at Westville, one at Decatur.
Thank you.
Mhm.
On page 102, the maintenance department. The day shifts at the top, elementary and school, the middle schools have their maintenance department. And it looks like there are fewer middle schools, so they have fewer maintenance people. But the high school has both a day shift and a night shift. Is that because they're dirtier, or what is this?
Basically because it's a larger campus.
Okay.
And they act as kind of a day supervisor and an evening lead, I should say lead for their staffs.
I'm just looking for discrepant things. I saw this a couple of places, a backflow technician. Is this sewage? Or what is it?
It's water.
Oh.
Water. We have backflow preventers at our locations that, yeah.
Okay.
So this is the stipend, is that correct? That
Yes.
you're looking at? Yeah. So our plumbers are able to do this if they're licensed to be able to maintain those from a preventative maintenance standpoint. We started doing that through a stipend as opposed to paying a company to come do that, and we're actually saving money through using our own plumbers.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
On page 111, this was the new teacher pay scale. I just want to compliment you because I did go through a session just a few days ago at the summer leadership. And I heard somebody from TASB, and it looks like you're doing a beautiful job there. So. On page 117, I just had a question because I thought that the Army or Navy or Air Force would be paying the ROTC instructors, but I noticed that there is a stipend of $4,000 for an ROTC person. So we're paying something to as well?
We get reimbursed. So we pay for the salary based on what the military tells us to pay. And so we do receive reimbursement from the military. And they actually determine our staffing levels based on our student participation as well. So it's a part of that federal funding that we receive in general fund.
Thank you. I know I keep looking at Chief Westbrook's because it involves money, but I do want to thank you, Mr. King. On page 118 and on the next following pages, they have the stipends for a lot of the athletic people and even department chairs and all kinds of things. But I was afraid that these stipends were outrageously overpriced or something like that. And when I look at the stipends these people are getting for how many times they stay after school with extra practices and how many hours and days they spend on buses going to athletic events, everything else, I need to do a heartfelt thanks to all of these people who are getting stipends that I wish they were 3 times as big. Okay, another discrepant event. On page 123, it says under section 6, the elementary team leads, the allotment's 10, and there's 10 there. But under secondary department chair allotment 8, and there's only 7 there. Are we going to add another one?
You may have just
page
caught an
123.
edit that's necessary, so we'll have to look at it and double check. Or we may have removed something at some point and then just didn't update that number.
Well, I just want to thank you. This is the most complete, organized, and it really helped do comparisons on the charts you did. And I was just fascinated on the different levels of expertise and the number of days they work. And it just made it a lot of clarity here. Thank you.
Well, and I would be remiss, Ms. Jensen, I appreciate your kind words, but my involvement with both of these documents has only been for 12 days. And so.
Who am I thanking here?
Yes, and so the yeoman's work was done by Ms. Westbrooks and Dr. Tamika McKeithen, who's also in the audience, into making the changes to this document based off of previous conversations. And so.
Yes. Then you got a super team here.
Yes.
I just had a couple. For counselors, page 87 for high school, this is the state recommendation? Are we matching the state recommendation 382 to 1?
What's the page?
Page 87.
I don't see our counseling team here this evening, and I don't have the state number in my head, but if I recall, I always thought that we were slightly less than what the state recommended.
Yes, Ms.
Okay.
Westbrooks, we have been below the state, and then we try to align with the ASCA recommendations, American School Counseling Association. And so our teacher or our counselor caseloads tend to be below the state requirements.
Okay. Seems high, but that's a whole nother meeting.
And I'm sorry, but also note too, at the high schools, that's our academic counselors, but they also have at-risk counselor and a college and career readiness counselor, or that's not the title. College Connections, I believe, is the other. So they have 2 additional counselors that are above the
And a
regular
CTE counselor
CTE
as well.
counselor. Thank
Yeah,
you.
college career and CTE.
Okay. And then just the last one was just on that first page, 74, where it has the elementary schools 24 to 1 / 27 to 1. There's different schools that have different, what is that?
I believe the 27 to 1 is for 5th grade, and
Okay.
the 24 to 1 is K through 4.
Okay, thank you.
I'm glad I was able to get one of those right tonight.
Thank you, Dr. King. I'll now entertain a motion that the Board of Trustees approve the revised Spring ISD staffing guidelines for the 2023-2024 school year.
President Durant, I move that the Board of Trustees approve the revised Spring ISD staffing guidelines for the 2023-2024 school year.
Second.
Moved by Trustee McDaniel and seconded by Trustee Newhouse that the board approve the revised Spring ISD staffing guidelines for 2023-2024 school year as presented. Is there any discussion, additional questions? Now I'll call for a vote. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. That motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. King. If you can please continue with your next item.
Yes, again, President Durant, our next agenda item is the 2023-2024 compensation plan. And once again, I'll ask that you refer to the one-page document with the summary of changes. There's been some new language added to the document this year. The first, as alluded to earlier this evening, we're giving the Board of Trustees the right to amend the plan if based on any action at a later date by the legislature. The second one, both of those changes are on page 2, is the pay information. As we know, there are some difficulties last year with pay verification and payments to employees. And so just acknowledging that it's a shared responsibility and what the district will do in that effort, and then what we ask our employees to do as well. And then on page 17, the criteria, specific criteria is actually included in our comp manual this year for the retention payment criteria, just for transparency. And it's good to have it in the document, just to be able to reference to when there are questions or an employee can see on their own. So that's the criteria for the different payments. 2 stipends have been added for a lead maintenance technician and a backflow preventer. As alluded to earlier this evening, the increase in police officer starting salary on page 50 has been increased to $60,008. And you may say, well, we discussed $60,000. And as I was sharing with Ms. Westbrooks, I believe it was yesterday, it's like, TK, how did we get to $60,008? Where did this $8 come from? But when you multiply out the hourly rate by then the daily rate, it becomes an issue of a penny, right? So you can't pay a half a penny. And so putting that extra penny in is what results in the extra $8, but $60,008 for our police officer starting salary. And then as a result of the feedback received from a recent internal audit, we've now included the supplemental pay schedules for athletics in the compensation manual. And so those are the summary of the changes and additions to the manual. And once again, ready to entertain any questions.
What is a backflow preventer?
A water preventer.
And what is
It
that?
prevents water contaminants from flowing back into the city's potable water supply. So anytime water goes into the building, it needs to go in one direction and not come back. And so we have those for like our fire suppression systems. They always have water in them. We have to protect the water from backflowing out of those systems. It's a standard for all buildings, pretty much. Our bigger buildings for sure.
It's like what you have on your sprinkler system.
Right.
Mark.
Yeah,
It keeps it from sucking that
but
water,
even
but it's
bigger. Right. You'll see some in lawns when they have out on the lawn too.
So do we have more than one person responsible for this, or is this one person that will receive?
It's generally in
this
our plumbing
stipend?
department, we have one person who's able to do that work. They need to be maintained on a regular basis, but every 3 years they have to have a once over for what's called a double valve system. And so we have someone who has that training and capability and has been able to do it before. And as mentioned earlier, without that person and that stipend, we would be, and we have in the past, had to contract out for this work. And so this is actually in the long run saves us money.
So he gets his regular salary plus a $5,000.
When he's doing this work, he does, yes. Yeah.
When he's doing it. So he's not
Yeah, he's
responsible all
doing,
year long?
he is, you're right, you're right. Sorry.
I don't want to start any trouble here, but be sure when you're voting for this, you know that on page 165, you are voting for Kelly Services. Okay. 165.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Chief Russell, I believe that those rates are what we pay out of our local sub budget.
That's correct.
Right.
And so the substitute amount comes from general fund. The administrative markup is what's coming out of ESSER. I think the notation here is just that currently we're using Kelly Services to administer the substitute program, but the rates are Spring ISD's rates.
Okay, so we would pay that anyway.
Yes, ma'am.
And I can tell you, I volunteered in schools where a sub was not available, and they split up a class between other teachers, and it is miserable for everybody.
Don't have any other questions. I'll entertain a motion.
Madam President, I move that the Board of Trustees approve the compensation manual for the 2023-2024 school year.
Second.
Been moved by trustee Jensen and seconded by trustee Adams that the board approve the compensation manual for the 2023-2024 school year. Do we have any additional questions? All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Carries unanimously. Thank you. At this time, the Board of Trustees will now recess the open session and convene in a closed meeting in accordance with Texas Open Meetings Act, Section 551.071, 551.072, 551.074, and 551.076. No voting will take place in the closed session. Any action the board wishes to take as a result of the discussion in closed session will be done once we reconvene in open session, and the time is now 8:06 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. We will now reconvene and resume the special called session of the Board of Trustees, and the time is now 9:39 p.m. We will now address the items discussed during closed session. Are there any motions?
President Durant, I move that the board issue a school district teaching permit to the following individual, Carlton Jack, for the purpose of teaching non-core career and technology courses, and to authorize the superintendent or designee to notify the Commissioner of Education of the board's action.
Second.
Been moved by trustee McDaniel and seconded by trustee Newhouse that the board issue a school district teaching permit to the following individual, Carlton Jack, for the purpose of teaching non-core career and technology courses, and to authorize the superintendent or designee to notify the Commissioner of Education of the board's action. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Motion carries unanimously. Are there any other motions? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Madam President, I move that we adjourn our meeting for tonight.
Can I get a second?
Second.
It's been moved by trustee Newhouse and seconded by trustee Adams that we adjourn the special called session of the Board of Trustees. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Tonight's meeting adjourns at 9:41 p.m. Thank you, everyone.